Hello and welcome to this special print live stream on the no confidence motion that has been tabled in Pakistan's National Assembly against Prime Minister Imran Khan's government. We are going to be discussing what it entails and what it could be holding for the future of Pakistan's politics. I'm your host, Suchet Singh, and I'm joined by the National Security Editor of ThePrint, Praveen, Swami. Yesterday, Imran Khan held a rally, a massive show of strength, and he accused the role of foreign funding behind this conspiracy. What are your views?
It's fun, isn't it? It's a bit like Indian politics where everybody accuses each other of foreign funding. One of the prominent Islamist opposition leaders, Fazlur Rahman, had accused Imran Khan, of course, the Prime Minister, of receiving foreign funding. These allegations have flown thick and fast. And in fact, Imran's made a little bit of a career out of this because he's had allegations going back, many years now, that other politicians and political leaders were beholden to American interests or to other Western interests after 9/11. He even accused his political opponents of, so to speak, selling jihadists to the Americans. So this is the stuff of politics. It's stuff political leaders used to smear each other or their political platforms. I don't think there's very much substance to it. But in heated political climates, very often, when the muck is flying around, some of it does stick. And clearly, Imran Khan will be hoping, as he goes down, to show that he's the victim of a plot or a conspiracy to rally as much support as he can on his side.
Do you think he was specifically talking about the US when he's talking about foreign funding?
Absolutely, Suchet. I mean, I think that's where the finger was pointed. And recall that he had various things to say about the US private security mercenary firm, if you like, Blackwater in the past. For years after 9/11, there were all these sort of, very colorful allegations that Blackwater was some sort of state within the state and that Pakistan had allowed itself to be subverted by these American mercenaries. People in Imran Khan's cabinet have made these allegations in sort of various forms at various times. And like I said, I mean, in a country which has been as much of a crossroads for global geopolitics as Pakistan has since the 1970s, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There's a lot of conspiratorial stuff that gets enmeshed in the country's political life and narrative. And maybe it's just that in our part of the world, conspiracy theories fly in politics. We've seen similar things in various parts of South Asia. So, like I said, I mean, it's interesting, but I think it's just a political play rather than anything with a great deal of substance to it.
So a lot of the narrative around the trust vote has been around the economic condition of the country. So do you think that has been sort of like the pegging point for this to go through?
So Pakistan's economy, as I'm sure many of our viewers have been reading in ThePrint in recent weeks, Pakistan's economy is in a stupendous mess. And there are a few reasons for this. It's got to do with their poor export performance. It's got to do with some structural problems in the economy, like the non-payment of power bills. It's got to do with excessively high defense spending, which politicians don't like talking about so much, but a bunch of factors. But it's really come to a head because of two hammer blows that economies across the world have faced. And the first of those is, of course, COVID and all the dislocations it brought about to the trading system. And now high oil prices, high energy prices. And Pakistan, the background to this is that Imran Khan had claimed that his predecessors were too beholden to the International Monetary Fund and to Western economies, and that whatever he did, he wouldn't go to the IMF. This was a point of pride. And Imran Khan had made this a sort of core part of his economic manifesto, saying he was going to bring about economic independence. And of course, he hasn't been able to do that. It's not as simple as snapping your fingers and saying, I won't go to the IMF. Pakistan has been engaged in negotiations with the IMF for a period of time now. The latest negotiations have stalled because as the political situation deteriorated in Pakistan and it started becoming clear that the Prime Minister was in some trouble, he announced a sort of massive subsidy and handout package. And it's not very clear how the billions of rupees that are going to be involved in these subsidies, where these are going to come from. And the IMF wanted to know, exactly where the money for these handouts would come from and wasn't getting a very good answer. So negotiations on the newest tranche of IMF aid have been stalled. That, of course, sends a very bad signal to investors and to others. And this has further contributed to the sort of morass of economic problems he faces. But the real intention of Prime Minister Imran Khan wasn't to just dish out aid in a bad time. It was to announce cuts to energy prices, extensive subsidies, knowing that he's on his way out and making sure that his successor will have to be the bad guy who rolls back all this stuff and makes himself unpopular. I suspect, Imran Khan may be a lot of things, but he's a shrewd political operator. And he's thrown this into the pot to make life difficult for whoever comes next and has to roll all these subsidies back.
So sort of setting like an economic trap for the person coming.
An economic time bomb, if you like. The problem is that, what's good politics sometimes is very bad for the country. And it may well be possible that the successor decides that, hey, I don't want to roll all this stuff back. There's going to be an election 6 months, 3 months, a year down the road. So let's make all these tough economic decisions at that time or after that time rather than right now. We'll have to see how this pans out.
Just before we move on to our viewers' questions, I just wanted to ask, where do you think the army is positioned and how do you think they're going to maneuver this vote?
So as I've written, Suchet, I don't believe Prime Minister Khan is on his way out because of his awful management of Pakistan's various problems, whether they're national security or whether they're the economy. He's on his way out because he crossed the army's absolute red line, which is no interference by a political leader in the army's business. Last year, as you know, Imran Khan tried to resisted pressure from the army to transfer out Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid, the ISI chief. Faiz Hamid has been a close political ally of Imran Khan's. In some telling of the story, he was instrumental in bringing about the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf Party's electoral win back in 2018. And Imran Khan really wanted Faiz Hamid to stay. But for the army chief, that was a red line. In the Pakistani system, a prime minister doesn't get to make those decisions. And many past prime ministers, Nawaz Sharif, of course, paid the price for it on multiple occasions. Asif Ali Zardari's efforts to push back the military's autonomy in decision making, he paid a price for. But this red line was crossed. And I think when this red line was crossed, the army made up its mind that Imran has to go. It's shuffled the deck to make that possible. And a lot of people who will likely vote against Imran Khan in the coming confidence vote wouldn't have been on the end of the fence they're on right now if they weren't convinced that the army wanted the prime minister out. So the real victors of this, in my view, is not going to be Pakistani democracy. It's going to be the generals who've made very clear who actually calls the shots in their system.
Just as a follow-up to that, one of our viewers is asking that if, say, the trust voters go through and the government falls, to what extent do you think the army will come back to power and it not being like a sort of civilian administration?
This is a really interesting question. And one of the things we've seen happening over a number of years now, since the 99 coup, is that the army has sort of taken the trump card out of its own deck. It doesn't threaten prime ministers with a coup. And the reason for that is probably quite a smart one. And I think it's because the army figured out that it could run the show without actually taking the responsibility that comes with running the show. So, of course, if you throw a prime minister out, if you have a coup, all the bad stuff, like this economy stuff, like foreign policy management, like terrorism, all of it lands on your lap. And General Pervez Musharraf, Pakistan's former military ruler, ended up becoming very unpopular with a lot of ordinary people in Pakistan because some of these tough decisions had to be made. And the army found that it was sort of carrying the can for these tough decisions. And they have now what is sometimes called hybrid rule, which is that you have an elected prime minister, you have an elected party system, but the army behind the scenes ultimately calls the shots. It can ensure the election is nudged in a direction that gives it the outcomes it wants, and it has enough influence with all the political actors to push them in the direction it likes. What does this in the long term mean? We don't know. We know that Prime Minister Imran Khan did not get his say on who he wanted as ISI chief. It's quite possible he would have wanted General Faiz Hamid as the next Pakistan army chief, and he didn't get his say in that. So he discovered there is this red line. But if over a period of many years or decades the army isn't willing to play the coup card, maybe eventually the power of the civilians will expand to the point where you get a normal functioning democracy. Maybe not. But the state of play right now is, there's a former Prime Minister of Pakistan, I won't name him, who had this wonderful story. Some Indian journalists had congratulated him on winning the elections and taking office. And he replied, yes, well, Pakistan has many serious problems. It has the economy, it has Afghanistan, it has civil-military relations. So General Saab is going to deal with those. I'll deal with all the other stuff. And that is really the situation of the Prime Minister of Pakistan. That's how it was, and probably that's how it's going to remain.
So another one of our viewers has a follow-up to this similar sort of scenario. They say if the trust vote goes through and the no confidence motion is passed, and say the government falls, but another government cannot come in, do you think there'll be a snap election or the chances of Imran Khan getting elected again?
So what we're hearing from the Pakistani opposition, particularly the PMLN, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party, is that they would like to install Nawaz Sharif's brother, the former Punjab Chief Minister Shahbaz Sharif, as a kind of interim Prime Minister. And there seems to be some consensus building around this right now. Now, obviously, it's not a very stable arrangement for a couple of reasons. A, the PMLN, the most charismatic, tallest leader is Nawaz Sharif. And they would like him eventually to be in charge of a proper elected government there. Asif Ali Zardari again has ambitions for his son. He would like to see Bilawal in some position of responsibility and greater authority than will be possible in an interim arrangement. And don't rule out Imran Khan, who still thinks that he's being pushed out of office by the generals, that the only reason he's falling is skullduggery, and would like the chance to prove that in an election. My guess is that the next few months, this interim arrangement will roll on. Elections were due anyway in 23. Maybe this government will last until then. Maybe it won't last until then. But this will be an interim arrangement to prepare the ground for whoever comes next. It may just also turn out that the next election is tighter than we imagine. The generals would, after all, like to see a divided coalition government that they can manipulate or prod the most easily. And that's probably the outcome we will get from a future election. But what we're seeing now is, if you like, just punctuation, the lunch break before the real game.
So another one of our viewers is asking, like, prior to the no confidence motion and the vote, Imran Khan in a few speeches had sort of praised Indian foreign policy. Would you think this was some sort of prayer towards the vote, or?
And I should preface what I'm going to say next by saying that the value of praise depends on who's giving it. And you should always be very careful of praise coming from people whose own record is not great. I think what Imran Khan was trying to do was justify his actions in Pakistan, which got a lot of stick because, as you know, he went to Russia just as the Ukraine invasion was beginning. And he got a tremendous amount of stick for this decision, which seems to have been made against the advice of the Pakistani Foreign Office, saying, why on earth do you want to go to Russia just as a war is beginning, and completely alienating your Western supporters? After that, there was a very embarrassing episode where the Pakistani NSA was supposed to go for a function in London that ended up getting cancelled in a quite clear show of Western displeasure. And the backstory to this, of course, is that Imran's relationship with China, which is the other of Pakistan's big external supporters, has been quite bad. The Chinese have been quite unhappy, in particular, with his management of the economy and with what they believe is the fact that his policies haven't let Chinese companies who invested in Pakistan make a decent profit. So quite a lot of irritation on the Chinese side as well. And it takes quite some talent to irritate both the Americans and the Chinese at the same time. So Imran was trying to, I think, justify his policies by saying, look at the Indians. They're not falling in the American camp or the Chinese camp. I salute them for doing what I'm doing. Right? So it was a kind of backhanded compliment to himself, delivered in this slightly circuitous way. And it's, of course, ironic because Imran Khan has had a number of things to say about Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the past, which have, I don't know how to put this, but not been very complimentary. So this sudden admiration for India was, of course, a matter of some surprise. But I think he was justifying his own actions and looking for other people to stand them up against. I don't think there was any change of heart on India over there.
Given that if the motion passes or doesn't, there's still, say, the chance of an election, whether it's a snap election or election later, which is due in 23. Do you still think that Imran Khan enjoys significant public support?
So it's again a really interesting question, and the answer depends on who you talk to in Pakistani politics. So you'll get people from the PMLN swearing blind that Imran Khan has no support at all except on social media and Twitter, that his support base has dried out completely. And you have, of course, people in Imran Khan's party, the PTI, equally swearing passionately that, if anything, this intrigue and skullduggery which has gone on in recent weeks has rallied the nation behind him. We saw a rally over the weekend. You've seen the images coming out of it as well. And of course, a respectable sized crowd, if not a dramatic one. But personally, and I think we all know this from India, the size of a crowd that a politician draws is not very much of an indicator of where they stand on the political spectrum. But I think it's fair to say that Imran Khan has a very committed constituency, both in the Pakistani diaspora and at home, which saw him as a force for change, someone different from the sort of traditional corrupt power brokers. If you like the sort of, it's not a very good analogy because Imran Khan is so much more flamboyant than the person I'm going to mention, but sort of like the Arvind Kejriwal of Pakistani politics. Anti-corruption, honesty, straight talk, those kinds of things, not, this money-making party. So I suspect some of that momentum is still with him. But I think there's also a genuine feeling of being fed up with false promises, with things not quite, with mismanagement, with chaos. And I think the election, whenever it happens, is not one that he's going to have an easy time in. Let's put it that way.
Do you think, given that the whole notion of the trust vote has gone on, can we suddenly see Nawaz Sharif return to Lahore or Islamabad?
Well, it's interesting, and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has reportedly been facing some problems pertaining to his continued stay in the United Kingdom. There was some sort of litigation ongoing with the British Home Office demonstrating some reluctance to extend his visa, which was given originally on medical grounds. And they seem to be saying that his health is now well enough for him to return, so that visa will not be extended. So clearly, and like any politician, I'm sure he loves being in the game and being in the thick of politics. So he's been wanting to go back. And there are a number of legal obstacles to his going back, one of them being that he was a proclaimed offender by the Pakistani courts in various corruption cases. And secondly, this threat of incarceration hanging over his head. One of the speculations being that as part of this deal being worked out to ease Imran Khan out of office, that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif will return. Whether there's no doubt also that he'd like to see himself at the head of a political campaign, which eventually leads to his daughter Maryam Nawaz being in a position to stake her claim to be Prime Minister one day. But for that, he's got to go back and set the pieces in place. We'll see shortly if these rumors about a behind-the-scenes deal are correct or not.
And just before we come to the end of our live stream, do you think PMLQ, what sort of position do you think they'll take? It's very interesting what they've been up to.
They've been kind of sitting on the fence, haven't they?
Sort of hedging.
Well, like with all confidence votes, I think there are 17 legislators who are now, if I'm not wrong, not committed in what direction they're going in. And that's probably a smart move because they'd like to look for whatever benefits they can get out of this crew before the government falls. We don't know quite honestly when this vote will take place. So already the tabling of the no confidence motion was delayed beyond the constitutionally mandated deadline. Now, there can be anywhere between 3 days. My understanding is they have to debate this motion for a minimum of 3 days, but have up to 7 days before coming to a vote on it. There's meanwhile been a no confidence motion introduced in the Punjab Assembly as well, where they may be trying to bring the government down. So a lot of sort of pieces in play over here. And another interesting thing will be to watch how the base reacts to all of this. So you had, this giant gathering by Imran Khan's party over the weekend. Other parties have announced that they also want to mobilize. And Pakistan for large crowds is a dangerous place. We've had violence of various kinds before, even terrorist attacks. So, this much we can say the next few days are probably going to be something we'll be watching very closely. And hopefully coming back to our audience on a regular basis with whatever we can garner. But, this is going to be a test match, not a one-day innings. So it's going to take a few days before we get a fully clear picture on this.
Yeah, I think things are just at a precarious position and we'll get to know as time goes. Thank you so very much for joining us at this special live stream. Thank you, Praveen.
Thank you, Suchet.